Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from being a good start to a great one. This week, the commander we're discussing is a 3/3 elk. What? He got better. Kenrith the Returned King is a breakout star from Throne of Eldraine, a 5/5 for 5 mana with an activated ability in each color. He can give creatures haste and trample, make them bigger, gain life, draw cards, and/or revive players' dead creatures. When we take a peek at his EDHREC page, we see a lot of mana. He doesn't have too many high synergy cards, that is, cards that are more unique in his build compared to other 5-color decks, but the ones we do see make his abilities drastically easier to activate over and over and over again. His most popular inclusions are also almost always about the mana, even including some mana dorks. Mana fuels his abilities, giving him tons of options and flexibility at instant speed. The more mana he gets, the more he can bury his enemies with sheer value. This video is going to be a little bit tricky because Kenrith is pretty famous for a lot of reasons, and one of them is that he doesn't have to be built as a 5-color commander if you don't want to. If you would like to play Selesnya Kenrith or Jeskai Kenrith, these are totally things you can do. So up front, we are going to make the assumption that we are planning to play Kenrith as a 5-color deck. For another thing, Kenrith is highly political. If you want to, you can use his abilities on other players and pump up their creatures or give their team trample and haste, and so on. This is definitely something we should keep in mind while we're upgrading the list, maybe just keeping that political potential sort of in our back pocket or so. But to be clear, this is not going to be a group hug upgrade. And finally, Kenrith is one of the titans of the competitive commander sphere, which operates at the most pushed limits of the format. We're just upping the average here, so those won't necessarily be the directions that we're looking to tune up this particular list. But let's be mindful of how his reputation in CEDH maybe affects the data that we see, but more important, what lessons we can learn from that and the things that we can glean that will help gently improve our possibilities here. Alright, let's load up Kenrith's average deck into the Architect deck building website, and remember, any swaps that we make must either be cost neutral or help lower the price of the overall list. There's a lot going on here. This is not a deck that should stop at 10 mana sources, or go out of its way to find 10 draw effects. The more mana we accumulate, the more cards Kenrith can draw, so we can feel free to go overboard on mana sources. Mana is the final word. Additionally, the new card Emil the Blessed is already showing up in really high numbers for Kenrith, and for good reason, but we'll get to that in a moment. Let's make some upgrades based on the following categories. The first is definitely budget. After that, let's make sure that we defend the crown, and finally a section I'll call favors. We'll start with budget. As always, up with the average, but down with the price. This is going to be one of the bigger sections of the video because we're cutting a lot of cards here. Since Kenrith can be played as a very competitive commander, we get a lot of high power but also high price cards frequently recommended for him. I can't cut every single pricey card, but we are substantially going to slim this down. Because if there's one thing that's true of this royal kingdom, it's that it doesn't need a very big treasury for the deck to do what it wants to do. The very first card I'm chopping is definitely Mana Crypt. I've built entire decks for less money than the price of this card. We don't need it. The tutors also all catch my eye, from Vampiric Tutor, to Mystical Tutor, to Enlightened Tutor, to Demonic Tutor. Collectively, these cards come to, like, what, $200? Goodbye. Rhystic Study is getting reprinted in Jumpstart, but the supply is low and it's still really expensive right now, and frankly, if we prioritize mana over card draw, Kenrith can fulfill the role of drawing us a lot of cards. And speaking of which, Sylvan Library is how much money right now? Peace out. There's also the issue of the mana base. This mana base is, in a word, stacked, but it doesn't need to be. I'm only going to make a single swap here because Misty Rainforest is the most egregiously expensive of the entire mana base, and there's also no basic mountain in the deck list, which is probably because red is clearly the least necessary color in the deck, but I feel like we might still want to be able to search for a basic mountain sometimes. Ultimately, I just don't want the takeaway here to be that this mana base is perfect for every person starting out. If you fill this deck with Tri-lands or Vivid lands or basic lands, you'll be fine. I'm leaving this mana base mostly as is because I don't want to drown out the runtime of this video, but consider this mana base to be a lofty end goal and not the place you ought to start from. To cap this off, I want to make sure to add in Skyshroud Claim to this deck, because Kenrith loves all the ramp he can get, and I also think it's a safe assumption that no matter your mana base, you'll still make use of some manner of dual land that includes Forest in the card type, which makes this a very fantastic ramp spell that will help get you the colors you need. On the creature side of things, there are a lot of mana dorks in this deck, including expensive ones like Noble Hierarch and Bloom Tender. There are all types of cheap mana dorks out there in the world, so we'll be okay without these top-end ones. There are still a lot of non-budget cards in this list, but as long as we're talking about creatures, I feel the need to dwell on two in particular, Emil the Blessed and Dockside Extortionist. These are especially relevant with regards to what Kenrith's competitive side can teach us. Dockside Extortionist and Emil are not cheap, but what they do is create an infinite loop. Dockside can create tons of treasure, and Emil can use that treasure to blink the Dockside and then create even more mana. This creates a very powerful infinite mana combo, which Kenrith can then sink his abilities into, to great effect, and loops like this can take Kenrith in a very competitive direction, though for the record, CEDH builds rely on much more than just this particular loop. If you want a budget-friendly version of this type of combo, you can use a Peregrine Drake and a Deadeye Navigator here, for example, or a Vigian Graft Mage, which can untap the Incubation Druid that already shows up in the average list. You can also add a Composite Golem, which combines really nicely with Kenrith if you have an activated ability reducer in play, such as a Heartstone, which would create infinite mana by repeatedly bringing back the Golem. There are so many budget replacements if this is the direction you would like to take Kenrith. I'm leaving this expensive version of the combo in the average list because I've already cut like 10% of the deck just on the basis of budget alone, and I don't want to drift too far away from average just in section 1. But also, I do think it's important to maintain the presence of at least one infinite combo in the average list to do right by Kenrith's capabilities and be honest about a capacity of his strategy. I just also don't want to take it too much further, because when we look at the average list, the deck is really clearly not constructed to solely focus on combo. I'll touch on this point more later on to discuss the actual applications for Kenrith with infinite mana, but for now, just note that there are budget replacements to every single one of the cards in this list, including the ones that I did not directly address in this section. And really, what I think we all want is for me to stop just chopping a bunch of expensive cards on the list and actually make some recommendations of what to add. So let's get to that. Let's move to section 2, Defending the Crown. In retrospect, this section title kind of makes it sound like we're about to start playing with the Monarch mechanic here, which would be a very flavorful include, actually, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about ways to keep Kenrith happy and healthy, and ultimately elk-free. Mitch from Commander's Quarters has proven to me beyond a doubt that Sporefrog and Call Me a False Hope totally belong in Kenrith decks. Video links in the description below. Kenrith can revive these creatures to repeatedly fog at a moment's notice. That is amazing value at instant speed. Hop to it. I'm going to include 2 more 1-drops here as well, but these correspond to Kenrith's first ability, not his last one. Mother and Giver of Runes can tap to protect a creature, but normally have to wait a turn for Summoning Sickness to wear off. Kenrith, with his haste, says, nah, we have to keep our king alive because he's the deck's entire engine, so these creatures will really help us out. As it turns out, I'm not quite done with budget swaps either. Cyclonic Rift is just monstrously expensive, and Assassin's Trophy is pretty spendy too. I'm not gonna assume that all players have access to these cards right now, so I'm throwing in 2 Wraths that I think will help out a lot. Merciless Eviction is one of the best Wraths in Commander, given its sheer versatility, and I also kinda like Rout here more than in some other deck lists. Kenrith wants to hold up his mana a lot, so it's cool to have a Wrath effect that plays into that aspect of his instant speed strategy. Speaking of which, let's swap out the $10 Swan Song for a card that costs just a quarter. Unwind counters the spells that we care about and refunds our mana, so Kenrith can use his abilities again afterwards. Nifty. My final ad here will be a fun pet card that synergizes really nicely with Kenrith's toolkit. Cauldron of Souls. Persist brings creatures back with a -1 counter on them, and Kenrith can then put a +1 counter back onto those creatures, and those opposite counters will annihilate each other. This makes our board extremely difficult to deal with, which is exactly the type of fortification our kingdom needs. And hey, it pairs nicely with Emil's +1 counters too. Alright, let's move now to section 3, Favors. Note the quotation marks that were on this section. I'm not talking about playing politically, although for the record, you can totally do that. I'm also not talking about group hug, although that is a strategy that I personally enjoy. No, what I'm talking about is giving stuff to our opponents that they will hate. Kenrith's abilities can target anyone or anything. We can buff up our creatures, but also our opponents. We can gain life or give it away. A lot of Kenrith decks usually hyper-focus on his card draw ability, which is really good, believe me, but let's use every part of the buffalo here. It seems only fitting that we utilize these abilities not just for their defensive capabilities, but also sort of twist them into terrible downsides for our opponents. For instance, with a Willbreaker in play, Kenrith pumps and steals enemy creatures for 2 mana. Or with the enchantments Cowardice and Dismiss into Dream, we can delete them entirely. I'll throw in Horobi of Death's Wail here too, because it turns the act of targeting into a total nightmare. Voltron decks in particular are just almost never able to recover from strategies like this. People can't even equip a pair of boots without killing its target. And hey, remember that Cauldron of Souls from earlier? Yeah, it can target enemy creatures too, and those creatures would die from the Dismiss or Horobi trigger before the ability even resolves, so they won't even gain Persist, and they won't come back. There's another one here that verges a little more closely to the role of actually helping our opponents, and that's the card Generous Patron. When we put +1 counters on enemy creatures, it draws us cards. This does mean that we have to actually help another player, but us drawing cards for 2 mana is absolutely worth handing out a few measly counters. Plus, this can support our own creatures if we want, which is really nice with the effects of that Cauldron of Souls I keep mentioning. But we're not done giving our enemies gifts just yet. I feel like Kenrith's life gain ability gets overlooked as merely incidental, there just if we have nothing better to do with our mana. I honestly view this as one of his deadlier abilities. There's a veto in the deck list for a reason, y'all. Gaining life can be our way of chunking enemy life totals down to size. I'm adding in Sanguine Bond here to complement the veto, as well as the truly rude Tainted Remedy. Kenrith is such a generous king, isn't he? You gain 5 life, and you gain 5 life, and oops, that made you lose life instead? Are you saying you don't appreciate the king's generous gifts? These are a bunch of fun. I'd like to throw in one more very budget enchantment here too, to help weaponize that life gain even further. Angelic Accord can give us healthy defenders or an army of angels to help out. Consider Crested Sunmare here too, though that one is a little bit more expensive to acquire. I've talked a lot about life gain just now, but we need to return to Kenrith's other abilities, especially the card draw. Before we can do that though, I need to make some room in this list, and I'm cutting some sorceries to do so. Ponder is really cool, but it's also really small. That's a tiny cut, but much more severe are the cards Windfall and Scheming Symmetry. Scheming Symmetry is really bad when the game has gotten down to a 1-on-1, and Windfall lets our opponents draw 3 times as many cards as we do. Good for wheel decks, but not good for us here. Remember, we only want other players to get bad gifts. We don't want them to get good gifts, and these cards give them way too much benefit, and the peasants don't deserve that benefit. Peasants do not deserve to have... Did I say peasants? Wow, okay, sorry, I think the monarchy really goes to your head. Why are we happy the king has returned again exactly? This feels like one of those absolute power corrupts absolutely situations. In fact, you know what? Screw you, Kenrith. I'm cutting the card Happily Ever After, too. You don't get a happy ending. For real, though, you need a permanent of every color for this card to win, and we only have like 2.5 red permanents in the deck. This isn't worth the card slot. Okay, we've made room, so now let's talk about the card draw. There are 2 important cards still in this list that we need to address. Jace and Thassa's Oracle. These cards operate a lot like the card Laboratory Maniac, a card which doesn't appear in this list, but the reasons for that are pretty interesting. Remember the infinite mana combo we discussed earlier with Emil and Dockside? If Kenrith accumulates infinite mana, he can use his card draw ability to draw his entire library. With that, he can then cast the Jace, attempt to draw 1 more card, and then win the game. This is true of Labman too, but note that Labman as a creature is susceptible to a lot more forms of removal than Jace as a planeswalker. Attempting to draw a card only to have the Jace or the Labman get removed would cause Kenrith to lose the game instead of winning it. There's also, of course, the famous Thassa's Oracle, which is a triggered ability that will win the game on an empty library without posing as much of a risk. I'm going to end up cutting Jace and Thassa's Oracle, which I feel requires a complicated explanation, so bear with me. My main point will be that these cards are redundant. If we have infinite mana, we don't need these to win. The infinite mana combo is already kind of a secondary plan, not the main focus of the deck. And this particular average build is not sculpted around the construction of infinite mana combos, so these 2 card slots that help support one backup plan is less necessary. Plus, Kenrith doesn't need either of these cards to still create a lethal board state whenever he gets infinite mana and draws his entire library. For example, if he gets infinite mana and draws his whole deck, he can then play any number of creatures in his hand, give them each a billion +1 counters, and give the whole team trample and haste. Or he can cast that veto and give himself infinite life and drain his enemies that way. Or he can have his opponents draw their entire libraries. That last one sounds riskier because if opponents draw their whole decks, they might find some type of instant that might save them in that situation. But Kenrith can still be really tricky here by holding priority and stacking 1,000 draw activations that would resolve after that opponent casts an instant, or more importantly, can make them still draw 1,000 more cards before that instant even resolves because, you know, infinite mana. So this is a bit thorny, but not as risky as it initially seems. If you're interested in using Kenrith for the infinite combos, then Thassa's Oracle and friends are certainly the cleanest way to achieve it, and Lord knows the competitive community uses more than just infinite mana to achieve victory through these types of means. Definitely look up their strategies if you're interested in taking this deck in that direction. But if you're building off of the average foundations, like the ones we find here, which aren't specifically built around constructing a combo Kenrith deck, don't feel pressured to include cards that specifically make a secondary plan more effective. Especially when that secondary plan already allows you to, gain infinite life and draw as many cards as you like and deck other players out and pump up your creatures to infinity and beyond and then give them all haste and trample. I don't know, it seems like for a secondary plan, it's doing pretty okay on its own. Alright, there's one final card that I'm adding in this favors section, and it is extremely silly. I used this in my old Crewfix deck and I was never sorry to see it. This is the enchantment Awakening. It is a creature and land specific version of Seedborn Muse for everybody. This is a substantial gift to give to everybody, but if deployed at the proper moment, you'll be the only one to take proper advantage of it. Pair it with Leyline of Anticipation effects as you upgrade the list with pricier cards, and then go to town activating Kenrith whenever and wherever you like. That leaves us with this final list. You can find the link in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. His Majesty the King Kenrith would like to thank his royal subjects, and asks that if you have any ways that you might recommend improving his reign or upgrading his throne room, that you leave them in the comments below for your fellow members of the court, as well as any other suggestions you have for commanders that you would like to see in future Upping the Average videos. Thanks so much for watching.